Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bush School of Government and Public Service in the Annenberg Conference Center. This is the Scowcroft Institute's first event of spring 2018 semester. I am Andrew Natsius, the director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce a friend and colleague of many years, Professor Victor Cha. Dr. Cha holds the D.S. Song Korea Foundation Chair in Asian Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and the first holder of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Cha is the former director for Asian Studies at the National Security Council, where he served as an advisor to President George W. Bush from 2004 to 2007. The recipient of 2 outstanding service commendations during his tenure at the White House, Professor Cha is also the award-winning author of Alignment Despite Antagonism and Beyond. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, International Security, and Political Science, Quarterly, among many other journals. He is perhaps one of the 3 or 4 leading experts in the world on North Korea, and has been interviewed on many national news outlets, particularly when Kim Jong-un threatens to bomb us. They immediately call Victor up and say, "Are the missiles on the way?" He's been on ABC News, CBS, NBC, and I could just go through the list. And he's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, on and on. He also wrote Alignment, Nuclear North Korea, which was published about 15 years ago with David Kang. He also wrote Beyond the Final Score, The Politics of Sports in Asia. I have not read that book. I've read many of his other books, but not that one. He recently published, what I think he's going to speak on this evening, Powerplay, The Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia. And he published a few years ago, North Korea, The Impossible State, which is a encyclopedia of narrative and history of North Korean analysis as well. He's the co-editor of the New Contemporary Asia series at Columbia University Press. He serves on the editorial board of many scholarly journals and recently joined the board of advisors for the Center for New American Security. He was born in New York City and holds a BA, a Master's in International Affairs, and a PhD from Columbia University, and a master's degree from Oxford University. Please welcome Dr. Victor Cha. Thank
you. Well, thank you, Andrew, for that very kind and long introduction. I just got in from the airport and the car, so I appreciated a minute to get a mint in my mouth that I'm trying to finish right now. But it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first trip to College Station, so I'm very excited to be here. It's a beautiful campus that you have, and I look forward to our discussion this evening. So I'm going to talk about sort of our U.S. alliances in Asia, but I thought I'd start the discussion by talking a little bit about this book that I wrote on the origins of the alliance system in Asia, as sort of a segue into whatever topics that you would like to discuss with regard to Asia, the Korean Peninsula, the Olympics, whatever you would like. But to start off, I should say that I think there are probably a number of you in here who have written books, and every book tells a story, but there's a story behind every book. Maybe some of you students haven't, but some of you faculty have. Every book tells a story, and there's a story behind every book. And the story behind this book, Powerplay, that Andrew mentioned, that was published in 2016, was that I was teaching a course at Georgetown on East Asian security. And I was doing one particular lecture on why it was that NATO was different from the U.S. alliance system in Asia. And I was going through, in the lecture, I was going through all the arguments as to why. One of the arguments that people have put forward is geography, right? In the sense that in Europe, you had a contiguous land theater with a clear dividing line in the middle between the East and the West, and therefore, for that reason, it was that sort of geographic theater was easier to sort of create one large alliance on one side, NATO, and the Eastern Bloc on the other side, right? Whereas in Asia, the geography is much more dispersed, right? You have a continental theater, you have a maritime theater, you have all these different things, so it's harder to sort of create these two blocks. Another argument for this it focuses on polarity or power, in the sense that in Europe you had two poles, right? You had the U.S. the U.S. and the Soviet poles, right? Two poles, and there was a clear and clean balance of power between those two poles, which again is conducive to sort of the formation of a NATO-type alliance on the one hand. In Asia, it wasn't so clear. You didn't have two poles, right? You had the United States, you had the Soviets, but balance of power in Asia was always complicated by a third pole, right? And that was China. Right? And so for that reason, you couldn't develop these two. So I'm basically going through all of these arguments. Another one was economics, right? Basically, at the end of World War II, although Europe was devastated, there were still higher levels of economic interdependence in Europe than there were in Asia. Right? And because there were higher levels of economic interdependence, that was much more conducive to building a single community, whereas in Asia, you didn't have that. So I was going through all of these arguments as to why Europe was different from Asia. And as I was going through these arguments, a student walks into the class late, right? And whether you're students or faculty, I'm sure you've all experienced this. Student walks into the class late, doesn't want to be seen, kind of sneaks into the back row, try very quietly, hopefully while you're not looking, while you're staring at the PowerPoint or something. But what many students don't know is that when you stand up here and you're looking at an audience, you can see everything. Everything, right? I can see, someone just raised their hand to cough into their mouth, right? I can see everything from up here. And so this student, I guess, realized that I saw him come in late. And, but I didn't skip a beat, I just continued my lecture. But I think he felt guilty because this student came late to class all the time. The class met at 11 o'clock in the morning. But every time he looked like he had just rolled out of bed right into the classroom. And so I guess he sort of felt a little bit uncomfortable, so he made an effort to raise his hand and ask a question. So he raises his hand, and I call on the student. I said, "What's your question?" And he goes, "So, Professor Cha, I don't understand. Why is it that the United States chose to build a bilateral alliance system in Asia and build NATO in Europe?" And I looked at him and I said, "That's what we've been talking about for the past half hour." Right? I mean, maybe you missed it because you came in late, but that's what we were talking about for the past half hour. And, clearly the student felt quite embarrassed by all of this. And after class, he sort of came, scuttled down the aisle and sort of said, "I'm really sorry, I won't be late for class anymore." Of course, he was late next week as well. But the interesting thing was, as I was walking back to my office, I was thinking about his question, and I thought it was actually a very good question. Even though he may not have intended it to be a very good question, it was a very good question, because every explanation that I had given for why NATO was different from the U.S. alliance system in Asia, none of those explanations focused on choice. Right? They were structural explanations having to do with geography, economic explanations, explanations based on power, but none of them had actually dealt with the question of why did the United States choose to build alliances in Europe and Asia differently at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, U.S. power was supreme. There was no country that was stronger on the face of the earth by any stretch of the imagination than the United States. So the United States could pretty much have done what it wanted to do. But why did they choose, right, to build this particular system in Asia, a so-called hub and spoke system, right, a network of bilateral alliances? Whereas in Europe, they built NATO, right? The United States built NATO. So it was actually that student's question that got me to thinking about this book and led to my writing this book. I didn't dedicate the book to the students, to that student. I don't remember the student's name, and I don't even remember what grade he got in the class. But it was a very good question, and that's really what got me into this particular topic. This is a book that actually it took me 12 years to write. I'd started it in 2004 and made some progress on it, and then I had to stop because I took a job in President Bush's NSC, President George W. Bush's second term in the NSC. So I had to stop working on the book for 3 years, and then when I came back to Georgetown in 2007, I just got distracted by other things. But I eventually got back to finishing the book, and so that's always a good thing when you can finish something that you started. So the question in the book, as I said, is, why did the United States design a security architecture in Asia that was different from the security architecture it designed in Europe? Why did it build NATO in Asia, a very sophisticated multilateral institution in Europe, whereas it went for a much more simple set of bilateral alliance treaties in Asia? Right? Why did the United States choose a multilateral design for Europe and a bilateral design for Asia? Why did it choose an inclusive design for Europe, right, including all the countries, and an exclusive design for Asia? More broadly, for international relations, the question is, why do different security institutional designs emerge in different parts of the world? And why do great powers, like the United States at the end of World War II, choose particular designs for particular parts of the world? I've learned with these sorts of book talks, I've done enough of these that you sort of get your punchline in the beginning in case you don't get to it in the end. And so the answer for why the United States chose a different design for Europe and Asia was something I call the power play. Right? And what that is essentially is that the United States had a very unique situation in Asia at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And there are two particular elements of it. The United States, the unique situation was that it had a set of dangerous partners in Asia, and it also had a particular set of strategic beliefs about Asia. Right? And it was basically the combination of those things that led to the alliance system. Now, what do I mean by dangerous partners? Essentially, this was the beginning of the Cold War. The United States was looking for good Cold War allies, right? Great, strong anti-communist allies in Asia. And Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan and Syngman Rhee in Korea were strong anti-communists, right? I mean, they were vehement anti-communists. And that was a good thing for the overall U.S. Cold War effort in Asia. However, they were also two leaders that had questionable domestic legitimacy, right, in the sense that they may have strode atop of constitutional democracies, but they didn't run the countries like democracies. These were also two leaders that were, each of them, embroiled in their own civil wars, right? Chiang Kai-shek with mainland China and Syngman Rhee with North Korea. And in addition to all of that, they were both leaders that had revisionist intentions, right? That were not satisfied with the status quo, that wanted to change the status quo. In Chiang Kai-shek's case, he wanted to retake the mainland, and in Syngman Rhee's case, he wanted to retake North Korea, unify the Korean Peninsula. And so the problem the United States faced was that these were good, strong anti-communist allies, but they also were dangerous in the sense that they could entrap the United States in a war in Asia when everybody felt that the main theater that they had to be concerned with was Europe. Right? And so there was a real concern that these countries would try to entrap the United States. Chiang Kai-shek, whether it was in Burma or on the offshore islands, was doing things deliberately to try to provoke the Chinese into broader hostilities that then would force the United States to enter a war with mainland China. Chiang Kai-shek wrote a Christmas card to Eisenhower in which he talked about how the United States needed to stem the tide of communism, had to realize that its strong anti-communist allies who were ready to fight were in Asia, not in Europe, and that the United States should execute a nuclear war on mainland China. And then he ended the Christmas card by saying, "Merry Christmas and Happy New Year." Right? Syngman Rhee had his own version of this. It was something in Korean. It was called Pukjin Tongyil. It was unification by force. The South Korean leader was not happy with the armistice. When the armistice was signed in 1953, the South Koreans didn't want it to be signed. Syngman Rhee actually tried to sabotage the armistice talks by releasing 25,000 prisoners of war, which were a key part of the negotiations for an armistice. So these were deliberate efforts to try to draw the United States in. And this was not something that the United States wanted to do because, as I said, the main battle was going to be in Europe. If there was going to be a war with the Soviets, it was going to be in Europe. It wasn't going to be in Asia. And so the last thing, while the United States had to stem the tide of communism in Asia, the last thing it wanted was to get involved in a war with China, right? After having just come out of a war with China, right, in 1950 to 1953, the last thing they wanted to do was to get involved in another war with China when they felt like the main theater was in Europe. So if the U.S. was concerned that countries like Taiwan and South Korea might be rogue allies and try to pull the United States into a war, the natural reaction when you feel like you're going to be pulled into something is to pull back, right? So then that's the natural reaction, whether it is in a business deal, whether it's in war, whether it's in a personal relationship, like if you feel the other person is pulling you in, your natural reaction is to step back, right? But the problem that the United States faced at the time was that reaction to pull back was complicated by the dominant strategic belief at the time, right? And the dominant strategic belief at the time was something called the domino theory, right? The notion that if one of these small, insignificant countries fell to communism, they would all start to fall like dominoes behind the Iron Curtain. So even if the United States wanted to pull back from these potentially rogue allies, they couldn't, right? Because they felt like it would mean we'd lose the larger competition with the Soviets, right? So this was a unique dilemma that the United States had in Asia. And in the end, the answer was not to pull back from these potentially rogue allies, but to double down on them. To defend them in the Cold War conflict by forming alliances with these countries, but also to use those alliances as a means of controlling these countries so that they would not do something stupid that could pull the United States into an unwanted conflict. And this is what I call the power play, right? It was the establishment of a deep bilateral tie for the purpose of defending against communism, but also for the purpose of dealing with a very unique situation, which is, essentially overzealous or rogue allies. Countries that are doing what you want them to do, but you're worried because of alternate agendas they might have, they could overplay their hand and pull the United States in. So the best way to control for that was not to distance, given the domino theory, but to draw them close, draw them tight, and use that as a means of control. So the front end, the so-called front end of the power play, is the way we normally think about alliances. You form these alliances for the purposes of defending against a threat, right? These are good, strong allies. The back end of the power play is what I talk about a lot in the book. Not just to defend these allies against the Soviet and Chinese threat, but to control them from preventing the pulling of the United States into something that it didn't want to become involved in. And so there was a distinct preference for so-called bilateralism by the United States in how it thought about East Asia at the end of the Second World War. And even further evidence of this is the fact that not only did the United States prefer bilateralism as a form of control, but it also sought to push away or discourage any efforts at multilateralism in the region. So at one point, Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines came together and thought about creating a Pacific Pact, right? A Pacific version of NATO. And the Truman administration was expressly against it. Right? During the Korean War, Chiang Kai-shek offered to send a division to fight for the United States and South Korea and UN forces on the Korean Peninsula as an effort at sort of an anti-communist alliance. And MacArthur wanted it too. And the Truman administration deliberately said no, right? Strongly discouraged any sort of multilateral organization in Asia. So that was the case for China, Taiwan, and Korea. Japan was a little bit different, right? The power play for Japan was a little bit different. Because in the case of Japan, the concern was not that Japan would entrap the United States in a war, but it was still about control. Right? George Kennan believed at the time that the only great power in Asia for the foreseeable future was Japan. Right? It wasn't going to be China. The Soviets could not project power from where they were in Asia. And even if the Soviets and the Chinese teamed up together, Kennan's view was China was such a mess that it would just, the Soviets could never project power from China, right? That China was just, for the foreseeable future, was such a mess. So the only great power for the foreseeable future was Japan. And Kennan also believed that the U.S. position in Asia should largely be a maritime position. We are a maritime power in Asia, and therefore our interests align with the maritime countries. And Japan was a maritime power as well. So even though this was the defeated power in Asia, it was Kennan's view that the United States had to control the recovery and reintegration of Japan into the post-war order. Right? And as Kennan famously said, to make Japan into the Britain of Asia. Right? And so there's a very strong emphasis on control in this case as well. And initially, the United States thought about doing it like they did in Germany and Europe, to try to build Japan into some sort of network in Asia. But there's a not well known but very important trip that John Foster Dulles takes to Asia in February of 1952, where it's basically a fact-finding mission to sort of think about the alliance structure in Asia. And there's really not a lot written about this trip. I had to go to the Dulles papers at Princeton to sort of go through this. And Dulles never kept a diary of sort of this trip. So the only diary that exists is his wife's diary. So I read his wife's diary, which was interesting, but it didn't have enough of the stuff that I was looking for. But there's a record of speeches and statements and memorandums of conversation in the archives. And it's really interesting because when he takes this trip to Asia, he realizes first that none of the allies want the United States to hand over any responsibility in Asia's post-war order to Japan, because they all still didn't trust Japan. Right? Japan had been the enemy. And secondly, he also realized that Japan did not want to be sort of given any responsibility in Asia, because they felt like they were not ready. And so in the end, John Foster Dulles comes back from this trip, and he realizes that the best thing to do is to do like they were doing with China, with Taiwan and with Korea, was to form these direct bilateral alliances as a means of trying to control Japan's reintegration into post-war Asia. So that's basically the story. If you're interested in sort of Cold War and Cold War history, I love Cold War history, so that's why I wrote the book. I always tell my students the Cold War was a great time in that sense. It was just great. The Cold War was a great time to study international relations. But so naturally the question is, what does this all mean for today, right? What does this all mean for U.S. alliances and regional institutions in Asia today? And so I would say that there are basically, when we look at sort of East Asia and institutions today, and this is a generalization, so you have to excuse the generalization, there have basically been three waves of institution building in Asia, in current day Asia, right, after the U.S. alliance system. Right? The first happened sort of at the end of the Cold War, when we saw a plurilateralization, or some people call it a mini-lateralization of the U.S. bilateral alliance system in Asia. In other words, if the Cold War alliance system that was built in Asia was a so-called, were like the hub and spokes of a bicycle. The hub is the United States with these individual alliance relationships with countries, Thailand, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. The plurilateralization of the alliances after the end of the Cold War meant that those spokes started to get connected. Right? So instead of seeing U.S.-Japan alliance, U.S.-Korea alliance, we started seeing trilateral coordination, U.S., Japan, Korea. Instead of seeing U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Australia, we start seeing something called the TSD, right? The Trilateral Strategic Dialogue among the United States, Japan, and Australia. The Quad, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. So we see basically a connecting of the spokes, right? A plurilateralization of the U.S. alliance system, right? So that's one trend that we see. The other trend we see is more indigenous to the region in terms of institutionalization. It's based largely and generated largely by Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and it really emerges after the end of the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, where we see the growth of ASEAN-based institutions, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN +3, the East Asia Caucus. We see all these sorts of different ideas and institutions emerge that are largely driven by the ASEAN countries. Right? And then the third sort of wave of institutions in Asia is those that are centered on China, right? That really have emerged in the last decade, right? It's the most recent institutionalization of Asia. And these are a lot of institutions centered around Chinese development, not so much Chinese security, but largely centered around Chinese development and development funds. Things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, SICA, which is the security, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, CICA, RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, right? China's answer to the TPP, sort of their answer to the TPP. So we see these sort of emerging at the end, within the last 10 years. And so the question, in addition to that, with the emergence of China's institutions, it is also accompanied by a narrative that aims to delegitimize the traditional U.S. alliance system, right? Referring to new forms of security that don't require alliances, calling the U.S. alliance system selfish because it is exclusive, it's not inclusive, and even referring to it as Cold War dinosaurs, right? That these were alliances built out of the Cold War and they're no longer relevant to today's concerns in Asia. And so this has created a lot of discussion, debate in policy community and scholarly circles about where are we going with all these three ways of institutions, and is this some sort of zero-sum competition that's emerging between U.S.-based institutions, China-based institutions, and the indigenous institutions largely generated out of ASEAN. And so you have scholars like Kai He, who has written about so-called institutional balancing in Asia, that these institutions are balancing each other. The U.S.-based system is balancing the Chinese system. You have people like Evelyn Goh write about how these institutions serve a purpose in sort of enmeshing the big powers because they sort of pull the big powers into these institutions. And then we see a lot in the policy discussion about, how, should the United States have joined AIIB? What is the future after TPP? What is Chinese intentions with SICA, trying to design a different type of security institution in Asia. And so where I come down on all this based on the research I did for this book is that I don't think that there's a zero-sum competition happening in terms of all these institutions in Asia. I think the U.S. alliance system is still quite relevant. It is still the most important institution in Asia. It has left the deepest imprint and still has the deepest imprint in Asia. But at the same time, we should not think about institutions and these sorts of groupings in Asia in any sort of hierarchical fashion, right? There's no one institution that imposes hierarchy over the others. And we should dispense with the idea that there should be one institution, right? I mean, we have the European Union, we have NATO, and so because of our familiarity with the European example, we look to Asia and we go, there should be one institution, so let these guys fight it out to see which institution is going to be the most important one. In the end, what is emerging in Asia is a patchwork. It's a quilt. It's sort of a patchwork. It's very messy. Southeast Asian-based institutions, the U.S. alliance system, Chinese-based institutions, they're all emerging at the same time. They are parallel in some cases. They are interlinked in others. They are overlapped in other cases. And that itself is the architecture of Asia. And it's not going to be a competition between one or the other. And states in the region like to have choices, to work with the United States on security issues, to work with China on development issues, to work with ASEAN on disaster relief. There is what my colleague at Georgetown, Mark Bush, refers to as forum shopping that takes place when you have this sort of rich set of institutions in Asia. So is this efficient? No, it's not efficient at all. It's horribly inefficient. But sometimes, very complex, inefficient things are not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because you have to think about in Asia we have a rising power, we have lots of historical animosity, we have lots of mistrust. We have North Korea, enough said, right? Just, this rogue country that's doing all sorts of crazy things. And we've got all of this stuff moving around in Asia. And there's lots of security dilemmas, insecurity spirals. And so for this reason, having complexity in terms of the institutions may actually be a good thing, because it can help to mute some of the security dilemmas, to mute some of the historical antagonism, that allows countries to participate pragmatically in certain areas without having to sign up to an institution where everybody has to wear the same jacket, right, and vote on everything. So this kind of messiness may actually be a good thing for Asia, because in the end, Asia, is not Europe. And so with that, that's sort of a summary of the book. I'd be happy to take any questions you have on this or anything else that you'd like to talk about. Thank you.
We had a Russian South Korean scholar speak last semester, Andrei Lunkov. I don't know if you know Andrei. I know him. I've been known him for a number of years now. And he takes a much more less hawkish view of North Korea than you and I would take, because I know your views on North Korea. So what he argues is that Kim Jong-un wants to die in his bed an old man like his father and grandfather wanted to, that he does not want to go down in a conflagration that potentially destroys North Korea completely. And that he's not crazy, but that he's very rational. He may be playing us, but he's rational. On the other hand, he does say a lot of crazy things. I mean, there were just several years ago, they were running pictures, what it looked like New York City. It looked like the skyline of New York City, and there would be nuclear weapons from North Korea blowing up New York. So the only time they ask me to go on the radio in North Korea is when they're planning to bomb Austin. They call me in from the radio stations, are we going to be bombed in Austin? I said, well, number one, I don't even think they know where Austin is. Number two, no, they can't get here yet. And no, they're not going to start a war. But at least that's what I said. So what do you think? I mean, is he playing us? Is he crazy? Does this have to do with the internal dynamics of the North Korean state?
I certainly hope he's not crazy, because if he's crazy, then he can't be deterred, right? So, and that would be a bad thing, right? So the short answer is that we don't know. By the way, I should preface this by saying, so all my views tonight are my own views. They're not the views of past, present, or future employers. They're just my own views. So I feel like there's certain things that we do know, right? So we know for certain that since he has taken power, the regime has been single-mindedly focused on developing long-range nuclear missiles that can reach the United States. Just to give you an example, a measurement between 1994 and 2008, right? Between 1994 and 2008, North Korea did 17 ballistic missile tests and 1 nuclear test between 1994 and 2008. From January of 2009 until the end of the Obama administration, I think they did 80 ballistic missile tests and 4 nuclear tests. And in the first year of President Trump's term in office, they've already done, I think, 25 ballistic missile tests and 1 what is widely perceived to be a hydrogen bomb test. So by almost any, and the start of the Obama administration, January 2009, is not because I'm picking on President Obama. January 2009 is a significant date because it is when the Western world finds out that the previous leader of North Korea had a massive stroke in August of 2008. We all find that out in January of 2009, and that's when the testing really starts to pick up, presumably because this young fellow is behind the scenes starting to call the shots.
So that's one thing that's very clear, that, and he's changed the Constitution. Now, nuclear weapons are in the Constitution. And he is dead set on proving that he can reach anywhere in the United States, including Austin, Texas, with a nuclear-tipped ICBM. Right? So we know that for sure. Right? We also know that he took power very suddenly because his father had a massive stroke. He was only 27 years old or so when he took power, and he was clearly not ready in that sense. And so, there could be legitimacy issues involved there too. Andrew, you mentioned is some of this domestic. He had none of the. So, North Korea is this cult of personality leadership, and they build a story around each of the three leaders. His father had there was a history to his father that you could talk about, and to his grandfather, but this guy had no credentials whatsoever. And so he might see this as part of an effort to try to show that he can deliver something to the country that is significant by world standards. And the other thing we know is that he likes basketball, right? The only American that we know of that has met that has met the North Korean leader is Dennis Rodman, right? He's the only American that has met the North Korean leader. So this is like reality TV meets national security. There's nothing like it. You can't make this stuff up.
We had a State Department officer who was on the trip with Rodman just as an observer. Yeah. And they never published what Rodman actually said to Kim Jong-un. I couldn't say it in mixed company because it would be so crude. But the thing that was astonishing, I'm sure the report was correct because the guy's a professional diplomat. Yeah. He said, our mouths dropped on both sides when he said these things. Yeah. And he just laughed. Kim Jong-un just laughed. He thought it was hilarious. So
I wonder how it was interpreted.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But yeah, this is we know very little about this individual. What drives him, what motivates him. We have to induce from what he does, and so things we know for certain is that he is building up this program to threaten the United States. But then it's not clear for what purpose. Is he doing it for security? Is he doing it because he wants to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state? Is he doing it because he wants to beat South Korea, which in the end is the only thing that matters for North Korea, is beating South Korea. But then at the same time, as you have all been reading in the newspapers, in his New Year's address, all of a sudden he says he wants to participate in the Olympics now, the Winter Olympics in South Korea that will start February 8th, February 9th. So many different signals, and it's really difficult to get a sense of what is actually motivating him and how he operates.
During the presidential campaign, President Trump said that U.S. allies in NATO, but also in Korea and Japan, are not paying enough to support the U.S. military there. But at the same time, North Korea is demanding the U.S. Army leave South Korea. If there's any deal made, that might be part of what they're going to ask for in the deal. Under this situation, is there any possibility that the United States might decide to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula? And given the political ideology of the current elected head of state, President Moon, in South Korea, who's on the left. In fact, I think one of his senior people, was it the Minister of Defense, who couldn't get into the United States because they wouldn't give him a visa or something? Or was it the security chief?
Yeah, it was one of his advisors.
Okay.
One of his advisors. So, it's a good question. It's a hypothetical. That's, of course, impossible to answer. Let me just say that with allies like South Korea, Japan, and Germany, the United States has always had cost-sharing agreements. so-called host nation support agreements for the shared cost of stationing U.S. forces in these countries. These forces are there not solely for the purpose of the United States, obviously, but for the protection of these other allies. Every 3 or 4 years, there are negotiations that take place to negotiate the new cost-sharing arrangement. When we were last in government, I remember I didn't negotiate these, but I remember them taking place, and they were always, I remember, really difficult negotiations, because in the end, they're not about the things that I negotiated on, which was this mythical thing called North Korea's denuclearization, right? Host nation support negotiations are about real money, like it's real dollars and cents. So it's always a difficult negotiation. And I think we're headed into another round of these because the old ones are expiring. And I would imagine it's going to be a difficult negotiation again, because the president has made pretty clear that he wants these countries to pay more than they're paying now. They don't pay, obviously they're not paying everything now. They've negotiated shares, and he wants those shares to increase. So, and he's obviously not been shy about that. So, I anticipate when these negotiations come about, they're going to be negotiated on both sides quite hard. In terms of U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula, it's impossible to answer that question. I think the United States has had ground troops there, and they are not just a symbol of the U.S. commitment to South Korea, but I think they're broadly seen in the region as part of the broader U.S. commitment to the region. Rightly or wrongly, these troops, whether they're in Korea or in Japan, take on a meaning that goes beyond what they're stationed there to do. And so any significant change in the force levels will accompany that will be lots of talk in the region about what does that mean in terms of the overall U.S. position.
Does the United States actually have any interest in what goes on in North Korea other than the fact that they have been trying to develop nuclear weapons and a means to deliver them? If they didn't try to do that, and we had no evidence they were going to, would we care what happens in North Korea? Do we have any strategic interest there other than that?
It's a great question. Certainly, even if they didn't have nuclear weapons, there is the conventional military threat that they still pose to South Korea, and to the extent that we still consider the defense of South Korea as a U.S. alliance obligation, we will still be committed to that. But in addition to that, the other issue that doesn't get as much attention, but Andrew's very familiar with it, is we read about North Korea as being a nuclear weapons problem, a ballistic missile problem, a cyber problem, but there is a massive human rights problem in North Korea. This is, when all is said and done, and if this regime is ever gone, and we sort of go in there, open the books, this will be one of the worst, if not the worst, human rights disaster in modern history. This is a place where 10% of the population died because of famine. This is a place where 10% of the population died because of famine, and it was because of economic mismanagement. It wasn't because the regime didn't have food. And so, I would like to believe that we would still care about that even if they didn't have nuclear weapons.
Humanitarian issues.
Yes,
and human rights issues.
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
I co-chaired, as you know, for a number of years, the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, and we've produced a lot of those reports that apparently enraged Kim Jong-un and his father before him, which was one way we raised money, because we showed...
You showed that it had an impact.
They did have an impact. They upset the North Koreans. If you bring up human rights in a meeting with the North Koreans, the diplomats will get up and leave the room. They won't even talk about it. They get so upset. Yeah. So they're sensitive about it.
No, absolutely. Like as you know, my other hat is at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., our National Security Research Institute. And I mean, we must have done 100 programs on North Korea, nuclear weapons threat, conventional threat, cyber threat, all these other things. I think you were with us. We did one conference on the one-year anniversary of the UN Commission of Inquiry report, which was a UN report that documented comprehensively all the human rights abuses in North Korea, and in the end called for the North Korean leader to be taken before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity.
This is a UN report.
This
The
is a
UN
UN.
normally never proposes
Right.
things like that.
Yeah. And this was, again, it was on the one-year anniversary, so this is in February. Worse than the snow I faced in Washington this morning, we had a complete blizzard. It was a total blizzard, and the entire Washington was closed. The U.S. government shut down. But we had this conference the next day, and people had flown in from all over the place, including Justice Michael Kirby, the Australian judge who headed up the commission. So we pleaded to John Hamry, our boss, to allow us to open CSIS to hold the conference. We did. There were 15 television cameras there because we were the only game in town that day. There was nothing else going on. Everything else was closed. But the interesting thing, as your point, Andrew, was that we did 100 conferences on North Korean nuclear weapons, never a peep from the North Koreans. We did this one conference on human rights. They filed a formal protest with the State Department. In their Nodong Shinmun, which is the newspaper that is a mouthpiece for the government, they criticized by name the conference. And then at the UN Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva the following week, they again raised it. So it shows you that they are quite sensitive to this, because it really hits at the heart of the myth in the country that they live in a workers' paradise, right? And that gets directly to the legitimacy of the leadership in the regime.
Exactly. Friends of mine in South Korea tell me that the support, private support, not public support, for reunification has been diminishing as the specter of cost and what it could do to the South Korean economy, which, of course, the disparity between East Germany and West Germany was actually the smallest because East Germany was the richest of all of the communist states when it collapsed. And so the reunification, that still had problems. But the disparity between North Korea and South Korea is so massive at this point. Are people saying that publicly? Do they only say it privately?
So I think as a result of the German example, I think everybody learned that unification, although it's something that Koreans, I think, identify with, practically speaking, they understand it's going to be very difficult. They have always hoped for what's called a soft landing, which is a slow, phased, integrated, consensual unification process, as opposed to a hard landing, which is a collapse of the regime. And then unification basically falls into your lap. The views on it, I think, break down generationally. So what is often referred to as the Korean War generation, people who had lived through the Korean War, so like my mother's age, right, they still poll very strongly in favor of unification. By contrast, the younger generation in their 20s, they're millennials, right? The concept, the Korean War, unification, this is all stuff they read about in history books, right? They don't identify with it at all. They don't really even think about what's on the other side in North Korea. They just know one country. And so they don't identify with it ideationally, and they're also quite attuned to the practical costs that come with it. 10% surcharge on your income tax, or 5% sales tax surcharge. I mean, all these sorts of things.
Have they publicly discussed that in South Korea as a cost?
Yeah, they have. And what's interesting is that you had, prior to the current progressive government, you had a decade of conservative governments in Korea that we're really trying to turn around the narrative by saying that, by talking about unification, not as costly and difficult and dangerous, but as an opportunity, as something that could lead to, a couple of bad years, but then incredibly enhanced growth, all these sorts of positive things, the security dividend when there's no longer, a nuclear ICBM threat, all these sorts of things. But then, Korea's a democracy, and it swings pretty wildly between the two sides, and so we
don't know anything about that in the United States.
Right, right. It swings very widely between two sides, and now we have a progressive government in Korea that doesn't like to talk about unification in the
And they don't like
way.
to talk about human rights either, which is the
Yeah,
exact
that's-
opposite of almost every other government of the left in the world.
Yeah.
It's a very odd
Yeah.
situation.
No, it's true. When I try to explain to Americans like progressive government in South Korea, I go that when we say progressive government in South Korea, we're not talking about they're like they're pro-choice, right? Pro-gay marriage. Progressive is defined entirely by North Korea, right? And progressives, they see a threat from North Korea, but they prefer an engagement strategy, and they're kind of absent on the human rights issue, which you would not expect. But
No, not at all.
yeah,
So China obviously is the big gorilla at the table in Asia now. And when the South Korean government did something that China didn't like, that had severe repercussions, the Chinese imposed some real pain on the South Korean economy.
yeah.
Is South Korea now seeing that gorilla at the table and saying maybe it's time to accommodate ourselves to the reality of this $1.5 billion behemoth?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's
And Japan the same way. I
Yeah,
mean, is the
yeah.
same thing going to happen with Japan?
I think they are struggling with it, frankly. I think they're struggling with it a great deal. I think on the one hand, China long surpassed the United States as South Korea's largest trade partner. Now, South Korea exports more to China than it does to the United States and Japan combined. And so there is definitely an economic shadow that China casts over South Korea. At the same time, I think South Korea strategically sees its alignment, political and strategic alignment with the United States. But when you have a situation like we've had over the past year where, the United States put a terminal high altitude area defense battery, a THAAD battery, on the Korean Peninsula, that the Chinese reacted to very negatively. And so they not only called for that battery to be removed, but they have imposed all sorts of blatant sort of economic coercion to try to get the South Koreans to give that up.
Did they give it up?
No, it's still there. It's still there, but they wavered for a while, and it created a very bad optic, I think, here in the United States, because South Korea is an ally, right? They're an ally. They have fought with the United States in every war since the Korean War, right? They're an ally. And when they start wavering on a THAAD battery that is designed to protect U.S. forces so that U.S. forces can then defend the Korean Peninsula, that raised a lot of question marks in people's minds. And so, if you talk to the Koreans, they'll say, look, the battery's still there. The Chinese are still sanctioning us. We have not budged. But the fact that they were wavering, I think, surprised a lot of people. And so, I think...
You say a lot of people where? In South Korea or here?
Here.
Yeah.
Surprised a lot of people. And so I think it's going to be, Korea's going to face more and more of these choices going forward. When China proposed this AIIB, this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, at the time, the United States, the Obama administration, didn't want countries to join it because we didn't know what it was about yet. We have the Asian Development Bank, we have the World Bank. Why do we need another investment bank? But countries, lots of countries, including Britain, Australia, and South Korea, joined.
Yeah.
AIIB. And so I think for Korea, they're going to face more of these decisions where they're going to have to think about, I hate to put it so crudely, but what side are they going to take? And it's going to be difficult because for Korea, it's not just the China economic issue that complicates their thinking, it's the North Korea issue. Because in the end, whatever the South Koreans want to do with North Korea, they feel like they need China. If we want to sanction North Korea, if we want to put pressure on North Korea to get them back to the negotiating table, we need China. If they want to unify with North Korea, they need China. So they feel like wherever they go, China is sort of in that calculation. And for that reason, it makes their China policy very complicated and nuanced.
Are you concerned that North Korea's negotiations to send a delegation to the Olympics will cause a split between the United States and our ally in the South?
I don't think so at the moment. I mean, I think the Trump administration has welcomed North Korea's participation in the Olympics. It's a welcome reprieve from the really nasty cycles of provocations that we've been having. And so I think the administration has welcomed it. I think everybody agrees, in both Washington and Seoul, Tokyo, and others, all UN member states agree that if North Korea comes to the Olympics, we shouldn't start lifting sanctions on North Korea, because there are now 7 UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, a whole bunch of US sanctions, South Korean sanctions, Japanese sanctions for all the nuclear tests and the missile tests. And even if North Korea is invited to participate in the Olympics, I don't think there is, and I know that there's no daylight among the parties about lifting sanctions, because those sanctions have been put on North Korea for their WMD proliferation. Those sanctions are not on North Korea for boycotting the Olympics. If the sanctions were for boycotting the Olympics and they showed up, then you could lift them. But that's not what these sanctions are about. And I think all the parties involved understand that.
So the New York Times ran an article saying that China was building refugee camps. Jane Perlez is no slouch when it comes to reporting. She's been around 30 years. I knew her 30 years ago in Africa. And she said in an article in December, with evidence, that the Chinese are constructing refugee camps because of potential for collapse of the regime. Now, there's a debate among scientists and observers about whether or not the drought damaged the crop. My view is that Johns Hopkins analysis is correct, that they're going to face localized famine, not a national famine like the mid-90s, but they're going to see starvation deaths. It won't be like it was before, but it will be, they're under severe stress because there was no rain for, 5 or 6 months, and then they had massive rains and flooding that destroyed a lot of the areas that had survived the drought.
Right.
So they've got a serious food problem. Although they had increased production in the last few years because of some modest reforms, they still face a problem of food security, which is an existential threat to the survival of the regime ultimately. Is the North Korean regime at risk of collapsing? Because the argument I made in my book on the North Korean famine is if they have another famine of substantial size, they will not react, the North Korean people, the way they did the last time, which is just to accept things and hope the government will save them. This time, I think there'll be more potential for uprisings. There was 1 coup attempt in the last famine, maybe 2. There were more coup attempts that you reported in your book that I was aware of, but I linked one of them to the famine. So is there a risk this year or maybe next year of the regime unraveling?
I mean, this is the thing about the North Korean regime is everybody thought I don't know if you did, but I think a lot of people thought in the 90s when the famine hit, basically it hit like a year after the first leader of North Korea died. And so everybody thought the combination of the death of the leader and the famine and sort of really the end of Soviet support or Russian support for North Korea, that this confluence of factors would lead to a collapse, and it didn't, right? And the regime is still there. And then people thought that it wouldn't last, and I was one of them, frankly, that it wouldn't last much longer under this young fellow when he took over. And it's, 6 years later, it's still there. So, the food situation, leadership change, all these things, it's impossible to tell. I mean, North Korea is stable up until the day it's not, right? And that's about all that we can say. Now, having said that, I think that's a very credible hypothesis that could happen. I think the other one is if the regime were ever to redenominate the currency again.
Oh.
Yeah.
There was an attempt in, when was it, 7 years ago?
Yeah.
Not 2009 it was,
Yeah.
2009.
Yeah.
To, and there's a debate as to what they were trying to do. I think they're just trying to sweep all the money out of the accounts.
Yeah, I agree.
Of the Treasury. But they redenominated the currency, and they basically meant all people's savings in North Korea were completely wiped out within 2 weeks. And people took those savings to protect themselves against another famine. Because people, if you talk to the North Koreans when they go to China, they say, that was our kitty to buy food if this famine takes place again. It was all wiped out. There were uprisings when it took place.
Yeah. So what essentially they issued an order one day saying there's a new currency. You can exchange $250 worth of your old currency for the new currency, and that's it. Right? And so people had worked and scraped, had $5,000, $10,000 in their mattress, and all of a sudden it was gone. And the government did it because it felt like there was too much disposable income in the system. Right, and for a state-based ration system, that's dangerous when there's too much disposable income in the system. But it led to a lot of anger, right? A lot of anger from the North Korean people. And my personal view is that, given the way the regime is and its focus, its obsession with control, that sooner or later it's going to do that again in some form. Because if anything, since the last time they did it, markets have become even more prominent in North Korea, both official markets and black markets. And some of our own research at CSIS shows that something like 95% of North Korean citizens feel that they gain more from the market than they gain from the government public distribution system. And so...
Public distribution system is the way in which the government, from the founding of the Korean state after World War II under Kim Il-sung until recently, was the way they not recently, after the famine. It collapsed during the famine. It's the way they distributed food to people. It was basically a socialist system for food security.
Yeah.
And that's what caused the famine, the collapse of the PDS.
Yep.
I didn't realize you had done that research. It's very interesting research.
Yeah, it's some work we've been doing at CSA.
Maybe you should send that to Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, I don't know. We might get hacked if we did it.
One last question here. What institutions should we develop? Are there any new institutions that we should develop that we haven't, that aren't on the table for discussion right now, to add to this panoply we have, that you argue that's a very Burkean idea of keeping what we have and building on it, as opposed to sweeping away what exists and then all of a sudden we have a big mess in our hands.
Yeah. When I was last in government, one of the things, so I worked on the nuclear negotiations with North Korea, the last set of agreements. And one aspect of those negotiations was to try to envision what Northeast Asia would look like if there were no nuclear weapons in North Korea. The idea behind that being that the major powers of Northeast Asia, right, China, Japan, the two Koreas, the United States, and Russia, the one thing that does not exist in that part of Asia is some sort of security institution, right? We have the U.S. alliance system with Japan and Korea, but there's no security institution that involves all the major powers of Northeast Asia. And so one of the ideas, the aspirations behind the so-called six-party talks, these negotiations, was that if we could all be successful at denuclearizing North Korea, that could then become the platform for creating a security regime, a security institution of some sort in Northeast Asia among the major powers. Of all the powers that I'm talking about, these six powers, there has been major power war on every one of those dyads, right, throughout history. And so what's missing is some sort of security institution. That would be, if I could have my choice, what would be the one institution that you can have that isn't there today? That would be the one that I would want to have. And we tried to do it, but obviously we weren't very successful. But I think it still exists.
When did we try to do it?
In 2000, about 10 years ago, in 2007. Yeah. But all of it hinged on successful denuclearization of North Korea, and we haven't really succeeded at that. So, but I think it's one that scholars still talk about. So.
There's a story told, and I will not mention the political appointee's name, but he was a senior official in the State Department under Obama, and he tells the story that the Chinese told him, senior level Chinese, that when Kim Jong-il was still alive, the father of the current head of state, and the father announced he was going to choose as his successor Kim Jong-un, the current head of state, that the Chinese were so upset that they said, you will not appoint him without appointing a regent to govern the country. And the three terms they use, the kid is unstable, he is immature, and he has apparently a volcanic temper. He's not stupid. He's actually above average intelligence. And Kim Jong-il got so upset at the Chinese demand, very intrusive demand, that he got up and left the room. The story is now told, I'm sure you've seen the media account, that apparently the uncle who was chosen as the regent, who later was executed by his nephew, had gone to see Xi Jinping and said, we need a coup to take him out, and I'll run the country. And that got out to a Politburo member who was friends with the current head of state and told him, and that's why the uncle got executed. But I don't know if you've seen this story. Yeah. But is there any truth to it? I mean, is it? It's plausible.
It's plausible. I don't know. I mean, I don't. It's not. So his uncle was sort of, everybody thought would be the guy who would be advising him behind the scenes and everything. And as Andrew said, he was executed very viciously. But what's interesting about this is kind of gruesome, but what's interesting about the execution is the statement that they put out, the official statement that they put out, which was very uncharacteristic for North Korean propaganda statements, because it mentioned his ties to the outside, his ties to the Chinese, corrupting a younger generation of North Koreans, all the things that would feed the story that you're describing. So I can't imagine the Chinese are happy with this guy.
No,
yeah.
They're not. Anyway, thank you, Victor, for taking that long
It's my
trip
pleasure.
to Washington and visiting with us here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.